This is another episode of Standup Comedy, your host and MC, celebrating 40-plus years on the fringe of show business. Stories, interviews, and comedy sets from the famous and not so famous. Here's your host and MC, Scott Edwards.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. We have another fun interview for you today. This gentleman's an award-winning comedy writer. He worked on The Howard Stern Show, Mad Magazine, Comedy Central, and a regular at the Friars Club Roast. In fact, New York Times has done lots of stuff on him. He has also worked continually on Comedy Central, as I mentioned, the Friars Club, where he wrote Roast for William Shatner, Flavor Flav, Pat Cooper, Matt Lauer, and just celebrity after celebrity. It's so great. In 2009, he won the LA Comedy Award. Let's welcome him to the show. Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Berliner. Neil, welcome to the show. You have so many credits. It took a while to get through.
Wow, sounds like you got a big crowd there behind you.
You know, we're always working hard to keep the audience engaged, and they're so happy to have you on the show. You've been in comedy a long time, right?
Yeah, it's about 30 years now.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, how did you kind of get started as a stand-up comic? Like, what age were you?
Well, I didn't do stand-up till I was about 40, actually.
Really? That's kind of a late start.
Yeah, well, I wrote comedy. You know, I've been writing for a long time, since my 20s, I guess. When I was about 40, Artie Lang, a friend of mine, Artie Lang from the Stern Show, said to me that you have to get out there, feel what it's like to be a comedian, a stand-up comedian, and how an audience reacts to you. And so I decided to get out there as well as writing to do some stand-up.
Well, he was absolutely correct. There's nothing like getting on stage and getting that immediate response from an audience to give you true feedback on the material you're writing. But I didn't realize you'd been a writer for so many years before you hit the stage. And that must be where a lot of your credits come from. You were writing comedy long before stage performance. That is an interesting route to take to the stage. A lot of people can't write comedy without doing it. Did you find it easy, apparently?
Yeah, I've always been able to write jokes. It comes pretty naturally to me. But an interesting thing about, you asked about stand-up. I had an interesting route to doing stand-up because my other career is I'm a medical doctor. And I had a career actually speaking for drug companies, doing promotional talks for pharmaceutical companies across the country. And the way I did that was a drug rep came into my office, and told me that I could be a good speaker and made me a local speaker. And then I started doing these dinner talks and talks in doctors' offices, and I would make them funny. And making them funny made the drug companies use me more often, actually. So I became a top national. So I didn't realize it at the time, but I was really getting in training to do stand-up comedy by doing these pharmaceutical talks. That's how it really started for me. So it was sort of like a reverse process. I didn't realize I was setting myself up to do some stand-up later on in life, but that's how it happened for me.
That's really interesting, Neil. I mean, you're absolutely correct. That's kind of the opposite way, but I have a life with one foot in sales, and I know that adding comedy to any sort of sales pitch or presentation makes it that much more engaging, leads to more sales, and people seem to really appreciate it. You're a doctor of psychology? Psychiatry. Ooh, that's the big capital DR. Now, did you have a practice as well?
Yeah, I still do, actually. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I practice part-time. I spend more time per week, more hours per week now in comedy, but I still keep a practice going. I'm actually the medical director of a clinic. So, yeah, I still keep my hand.
kind of an underachiever, Neil.
Yeah, I also empty the dishwasher at home too.
Well, you've had such a fascinating life. So you're a doctor. You're doing some public speaking. You find you have a craft, a talent for writing comedy. So you start doing some writing for like Howard Stern and Mad Magazine and Comedy Central. And then at the really a late age of 40, you start hitting the stages. Do you remember your first joke as a stand-up comic, or what kind of comedy you were writing?
Yeah, well, it was a mess. So, typical story, first bombing story, right, when you start out. So, as I said, Artie Lang had told me that I should really get on stage to get the feel of it. So I said, one day I'll never forget, I was working in this clinic on the Lower East Side of New York, of Manhattan, and the New York Comedy Club was right across the street. I think it was like East 20th Street, something like that. And I said to myself, okay, tonight's going to be the night. When I get out of work, I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to convince the guy who's running it to give me like 5 or 10 minutes. But I had no material. So I decided what I would do is I would do roast lines from roasts I had written for. So I convinced this guy, his name is Buddy Flip, well-known comedian, and I convinced Buddy to let me up there. And I started doing these roast jokes, and the crowd, it was a very small crowd. I think it was a weeknight, like a Tuesday or Wednesday night. And the crowd is looking at me like, what is he doing? I would say, like, at the Shatner roast, I did this line for this comedian. And I soon realized that it wasn't going over because this wasn't the Shatner roast. This wasn't, X, Y, or Z roast. This is a comedy club, and what the hell are you doing up there? And to make matters worse, since I bombed there, I said, you know what? Maybe it was the audience. so I went across town. I went to the Gotham Comedy Club, and I convinced another guy. His name is Brian McGinnis, another New York comedian. I said, yeah, I'd like to get up there and sometime and do some comedy. But he thought I wanted to do it right then and there. So after bombing, he says, and now we have this comedy writer who wants to do a few minutes, Neil Berliner. So I had to get up there with the same horrible material. So I bombed twice within about 2 hours in Manhattan. So that's how I was introduced to doing stand-up comedy.
That is, what's interesting about that, Neil, is that's probably a great way to start your stand-up career, because if you don't, until you fail, until you bomb on stage, you don't really understand the dynamics of the audience engagement. And I think this is a great lesson for everybody listening to this podcast, is that here's a really talented comedy writer. You've already had tons of success writing comedy, but when presenting it live on stage, if you don't take into account the audience, the situation, and presentation, like it's different from a roast, from, doing a stage act. I mean, you really threw yourself into the fire and learned all those lessons in one night.
Exactly. And I never really came up there again unprepared. I understood that if I'm going to do something, I have to be prepared for it, know the logistics, like you said, know the crowd, know all the variables that you have to know to hopefully succeed.
Exactly.
And I also realized that I would never go up there with a mediocre joke. I would have to do jokes that I really felt were good. Every single joke. I would rather, and I tell people when I've taught comedy too, and I tell people, I'd rather you do 2 minutes of good stuff than 3 minutes of mediocre stuff. If you have any jokes you're not sure of, just take them out. You're better off just taking them out. I later heard Rodney Dangerfield say essentially the same thing, that every single joke in his routine has to be a killer joke. And if you listen to Rodney's stuff, the old stuff on like Carson, those old shows, every joke kills.
Well, yeah, and that's great advice, Neil. And I just think it's interesting that here's a prolific comedy writer that his first time on stage, he wasn't prepared, hadn't written anything, and quickly you learn the important lesson that being prepared and having your material. I would add the caveat that as a comedy producer and helping many, many comics get their feet in the industry, I did allow them time in the middle to work on new material. So you wanted to start strong, you could play with some material in the middle and then end really stronger. So it's a little bit different than your advice. I think it's okay to try new material in front of an audience, but it's all a learning, ladder of experience. It takes time. So your first time didn't go well. You started writing. Your second, third, and fourth time, did you feel you really got in sync with an audience, a live audience versus just writing?
Yeah. I mean, I took on hosting kind of gigs that weren't really high pressure kind of, of course, headlining gigs. I didn't have 45 minutes or anything like that. So a lot of my stand-up has been middling and, hosting, things like that, special events. So, I didn't want to put pressure on myself that I didn't need. So I only took events that I thought I would be well prepared for, that I could write good material for. And what you said about, allowing comics in the room to breathe. Yeah. I mean, and you have open mics for that too. So, there's different circumstances where you can try material. I mean, if you're really doing well, at a gig, the crowd's really into it, you can throw in some stuff and they'll probably go along with it,
Right,
if they're already along for the ride,
Exactly. And once they've
So you have to feel your way. You really have to feel your way. Every situation is different, but I agree with you. There's got to be some kind of venue for experimentation and get new material out there. That's for sure.
Well, you took a really correct path, Neil, and that I've suggested to several potential entertainers and stand-up comics, that a really good way to get a sense of interactions with an audience and that comfort level, that confidence that's so important in our industry, that emceeing shows or being the host of an event are terrific ways to get that experience and kind of sample the different audiences. So I think that even though you had kind of a rough first night, you learned quickly some of the advantages and techniques and opportunities to build your own material, build your own confidence, and kind of find your comedy voice on stage. I think that's really smart. Now, you were working all New York clubs. You're from the East Coast, right?
Yeah, I'm from Brooklyn originally, and most of my work has been in New York and now in Florida, South Florida. And I wrote for a show in LA for a while. I was writing for a show that was like a Tonight Show format kind of show, so I wrote monologues for that show. But yeah, most of my work's been in New York and Florida. But I wanted to say one thing about what you just mentioned about the host. I don't want to downplay the importance of being a host either, because the host has to really navigate the show. And one of my friends, Eddie Brill, he was the talent coordinator for Letterman, and he was the warm-up comedian for 17 years for Letterman. He always talks about the importance of the host in the show as well. He's hosted, several shows, and you have to be able to feel the audience, and just running the show is an important role in and of itself. So I don't want to downplay it's not like you're the opener if you're the host. The host is more important than the opener of a show, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, and I agree totally. And I hopefully I didn't make it sound like a lesser position, but I do think it's a good opportunity to find your comedy voice, get that experience, get that confidence, because you can do it. Let's say emceeing a club, you can do it over and over and over and kind of get things worked out. And I'm so happy you mentioned Eddie Brill. I've had a chance to interview him. In fact, I booked him for a big fundraiser coming up in a month, and he's been great to work with, and he is certainly the kind of professional that I think all comics should aspire to be. Now, you had such a strong start in comedy writing. How did you end up writing for, important people like Howard Stern or for Comedy Central?
Well, one thing led to another. It was sort of like a lattice. I got a break by having a friend call me and said, this old lady, this old white woman is doing rap at a club in Greenwich Village, and you should really come down to see her. Maybe you'd want to meet her and maybe even write for her. So this is about 20 years ago, I guess. And I went down to the Village and watched this woman, and she called herself Fruity Nutcake Rapping Granny. And she did an act, and she was dancing around. She's like, 75 years old, something like that. She had a pretty decent figure for an old woman, And after the show, I came up to her and said, look, I really liked your act, and I've written some comedy. What would you think of me kind of modernizing your act, like adding basically, I think I said sex, drugs, and rock and roll to her, if she even knew what that meant. And she said, oh, yeah, that'd be great. It'd be great. So I started writing lyrics for her. She did these, she called them verses. So they were really basically like rhymes. Like she did raps of these lines that she'd written. So I added a lot of, I added more rap oriented lines. I made them kind of more rap oriented. And as I said, like sex, drug, rock and roll kind of topics. And I got her a website. And back then we had an answering machine. So I put an answering machine in my office, actually. And a few months later, Casey Armstrong, who was a producer at the Howard Stern Show, left a message saying he wanted her on the show. So, I went crazy. I couldn't believe it because I was a big Stern fan way before that. And so my first break was bringing her to the Howard Stern Show. And she wound up doing, I think, 10, 15 appearances on the show. And I got to know everybody on the show. And at one point, I realized that if I'm really going to have any kind of career writing comedy, I better go beyond writing just for an 80-year-old woman. And
yeah.
I suggested that to a friend of mine at the show, Bob Levy. He was running the roasts at the Stern Show at that time. So I said, listen, Bob, I'd like to come down, show you some of my stuff and do some roasts besides, and actually they were doing a roast for Ronnie the limo driver at that time. And I asked him if Rappin' Granny could be on it. And he said, yeah. I said, yeah, but I'd really like to do more stuff. So make a long story short, I went down there to the Stern Show, the Sirius building in Manhattan, and one day, and they were having a lunch there by chance. And everybody at the show just about was at the lunch, except for Howard, actually, but just about everybody else. So it was in this private room at this restaurant, Del Frisco's, and they kind of knew me. They knew me from Rappin' Granny, but for some reason, I brought 7 or 8 copies of jokes that I had written on various celebrities, just roast jokes, all kinds of jokes and stuff. And at the end of the lunch, I get up and I announce that I said, listen, guys, you know me from Rappin' Granny, but I want to do more stuff. I want you to read this stuff. Let's go through a read through of these jokes, okay? And if you don't like them, you'll never see me again. But if you like them, maybe you could use me for some more stuff. So it turned out that the jokes went over well, and Artie Lang liked a lot of the stuff. And, it wound up, it resulted in me being able to write for 3 more roasts on the Stern Show. I wrote for the Andy Dick roast and the Gary Delabate roast and the Bob Bowie roast, and for Artie's roast, for the Artie Lang roast. And then that led to me being able to write for Artie at the Shatner roast, William Shatner roast in LA. We went to that, and it was great. I hung out with Sam Simon, one of the creators of The Simpsons. And Sam Simon liked Rappin' Granny. He actually did an episode where Homer Simpson was, raving about Rappin' Granny. Okay. And what's significant about that for me is that this is the first time my kids were like flipping out. They couldn't believe that Rappin' Granny was on The Simpsons. They were big Simpsons fans, So I finally got validation. I got validation with my kids,
It's so important. It's funny.
Because Rappin' Granny was on The Simpsons, But anyway, but the point is, one thing leads to another. That's how it is. You know how it is. You never know where you're going to go in show business or comedy. Any creative art, you never know where it's going to take you. Like I tell people, if you go to med school, you become a doctor. You basically know you're going to be a doctor, right? But if you decide you're going to be in comedy or any kind of performance art, you don't really know, where it's going to lead you to. You don't know what show you're going to wind up on or if it's going to go anywhere or anything. That's how it is.
Yeah, no, and you mentioned so many things. First off, I have heard of Rappin' Granny. I didn't know that you were the strength behind some of the material. That's great. And, of course, getting on The Simpsons gives you validation with anybody under 30 or 40 that, might have been difficult to get with Rappin' Granny. So I think that's great that your kids finally recognize that, dad's not just dad jokes. He actually has some stuff. But I think the lesson in what you just shared, Neil, is that you weren't afraid to put yourself out there. I mean, you walked into those clubs initially and asked to get on stage, which is so important. It's all about stage time, stage time, stage time. But then even in that room of important people that understood the industry to say, hey, here's some material I wrote, kill it, love it, whatever. You had to put yourself out there, and that takes balls and confidence. And I think that that's a great lesson for people. And look where it got you. I mean, so many great opportunities. And you are absolutely correct that in a lot of industries, but especially show business, you may start down one path and other opportunities open up, and you just have to find what works for you. Congratulations on kind of figuring that all out, either on purpose or accidentally. It sounds like it worked well.
Well, I'll tell you, you reminded me of something. I figured it out on purpose, and I did it actually at age 14. Because when I was about, I think I was 14 or 15, I decided I would write some jokes for Rodney Dangerfield. Because he had this club in Manhattan, Dangerfield's, And I had just started riding the train, by myself. I must have been about 14, I guess. And I took my mother's typewriter and took some index cards. And I wrote about 20 or 30 Rodney Dangerfield type jokes. And I just took the train to Manhattan one day and knocked on the door, and the manager took the jokes. He said, "Come back in a week." So I came back in a week. So I got a note from Rodney, which I still have actually, and it said, "Dear Neil, I'm a real tough customer, but keep at it. You're still young. Just I heard you're a young kid. Just keep at it, and you'll do fine." And you signed it, Rodney. So I say, "Well, Rodney said to keep at it. I better keep at it."
Yeah, that's a terrific boost as a child to get somebody even to read your material. And he was honest with you. Hey, it's not going to work for me, but you're young. You've got a good start. Keep at it. And that brings up a good point. You've worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. You mentioned Rodney a couple times, and I know you wrote for Howard Stern. Who in the comedy industry have you looked up to or admired? Is there anybody you've kind of looked at and tried to follow, or was there anybody that mentored you that might have made a difference in your life?
Yeah, I think so. I think, like when you rate baseball players, you do it by era. So I guess you have to look at different time frames, as to who helped you or affected you. But early on, in med school, the answer would be Jackie Mason for me, because my med school roommates and I had his albums on vinyl. Just to get through the difficulty of med school, to break it up, we would play his albums, and we really got into his material. And the guy was a genius, actually.
A legend.
So later on, when I graduated, I got a hold of him and became friendly with him, and he helped me a lot, actually. And I would say Jackie Mason was a big influence. And I think Artie Lang was probably my second biggest influence, because Artie Lang is a great joke writer. People just see him as this, he has this image for whatever it is. But he really knows how to take apart a joke and cut it to the bare bones. And that's something I tell people all the time, too, because, as I said, I've taught comedy at like the People's Improv Theater in New York and the World Series of Comedy. And a lot of comedians, even seasoned comedians, they put too many words in their joke. I mean, you know this. You've seen this. You've been around. So you've owned clubs, correct? You've owned comedy clubs?
Yeah, I had a chain of clubs for about 21 years. Got a chance to work with some of the best in the business.
Sure, of course. So but even the best people, they sometimes pad the jokes with too many words, and they put the punchline like in the middle instead of at the end. So, but Artie really helped me a lot with dynamics. So he showed me like a lot about joke writing, and I appreciate that.
Artie helping you dissect a joke is such an important lesson to learn for any comic, that it's not just about being able to write material. You have to work it on stage, hone it on stage. What I've used is a analogy is you have that lump of coal, you want to turn it into a diamond. And Artie was able to teach you the analysis of a joke and break it down. And I think getting a chance to meet and work with Jackie Mason is amazing. But for those that are younger listening to this podcast, go back on find that album, go to YouTube, find some old Jackie Mason material, and you'll see why he was so influential. I mean, Neil, you have to be the 10th or 15th comic that said Jackie had influence on you, and that's because he was a master of the craft of joke writing and then presenting it. I think that's really strong information to share. Now, as a experienced stand-up comic that had a difficult start, but you're also a doctor and a well-spoken person, what advice would you give somebody, or maybe what have you given yourself, if you could go back 20, 30 years to somebody that's interested in a career in comedy?
Well, given today's world, I would say being extremely well versed in social media is a very big key, because you can be the funniest person on the planet, but if you can't get the message out properly, then nothing will come of it. So in other words, you have to become your own publicity machine, and you have to know how to use memes and fonts and video and editing and all that stuff. It's become a very, very big part, I think, of being a comedian. And many comedians I've spoken to have confirmed this with me. And I see it. I mean, you have to be able to navigate that whole world, or else, nothing's going to happen. So I think, comedians spend a lot of time, a big portion of their day doing this kind of stuff now. Instagram, TikTok, all these things, you have to spend time on it. It's part of the job. You have to look at it as a big percentage of the job. Okay, it's the creative part, creating the material, but also knowing how to package it for social media so that the public will see it and the right people in the business will see it. So I think that would be my biggest tip. That's part of the education now, to educate yourself in that way.
Yeah, that's so well said, Neil. I mean, it is more, it's been mentioned previously, and I've taught a little bit of comedy myself, and as I know you have, and it is so much more than just being able to get up on stage and doing the creative writing that makes you original and funny. I mean, there's so many facets to this industry that people, I don't think, understand or maybe take for granted. I come from the 80s and 90s big wave of stand-up comedy, and it was different then. There was no internet. And so my advice back in those days is that you get on every stage you can, you perform anytime you can, you work a joke over and over and over and hone it down and get it so it works. So as you mentioned previously, it's always going to kill on stage. But you're right that in today's age, that the self-promotion and marketing you have to do, and of course social media is the key, you need to put yourself out there, kind of like you did in that room full of writers. If you don't put yourself out there, nothing's going to happen, right?
Right, and that's another thing. Some comedians are afraid to put any material out there. But I've told people that, look, if you have talent, you can always create material. So, for instance, I put my jokes on Facebook for years, and certain people noticed and got me gigs and propelled me in various ways, just because they didn't know me from anywhere except Facebook at that time. So I tell people to do that. You have to put some. I mean, even the top people. You look at Jim Gaffigan, or just about anybody, Maniscalco, all the big comedians put material out there. They're not afraid to put material out there. They're not afraid somebody's going to steal, 10 of their jokes or something. They have talent. They can produce jokes all the time, So, it's part of it that you have to. That's part of the marketing. You have to put your stuff out there, so you have to give samples of what your material is, so people will believe in you.
Right. And it's so important to build that base or foundation of your career, whether you're just getting started or already an established entertainer. If you don't keep promoting or branding yourself, you could fade away as fast as you came on. Now, you've alluded to, and I have done my research and know that you've been very prolific in sharing the techniques and lessons it takes to be a stand-up comic. You actually teach stand-up comedy. Can you share a little bit about that? There might be some potential listeners that could be customers.
Yeah, well, most of what I do is I have a joke writing course, basically. It goes through all types of jokes and how to construct a joke. And we do punch up of people's jokes. The students will bring in jokes sometimes, and I'll punch them up at the end of the class. And I talk about persona also, because the good stand-ups are based, the best stand-ups are actors when you come right down to it. Like you talked about Jackie Mason being a good technical joke writer. But if you see him on stage on Broadway, when he had those Broadway shows, those record-breaking shows from year after year, he had great timing, and he used different accents and just motions and stuff. So it really is. It comes down to acting. And the best stand-up comedians are the ones who get sitcoms. In other words, they're suitable. Somebody recognizes that they're suitable to do a sitcom, that they have acting ability. So I think to get jokes across on stage, it really takes acting ability. So I think that's a big part of it. I mean, even if you just want to be a stand-up comic, taking acting lessons is important, or at least being aware of the acting component. That's just not getting up there and telling jokes. You really have to be able to pitch the character or the persona you're trying to get across.
Yeah, that's really strong advice, Neil, because it's not as easy as, let's say if you were just a joke writer, you could go up with 5x7 cards and read jokes and that's not going to work. You have to sell or present or in some way put yourself, which is acting, into the material. And we've seen that with so much success. Everybody from Dave Coulier and Dana Carvey to Jerry Seinfeld and Yakov Smirnoff. I mean, they were not just funny people that could write material. They knew how to present it in a way that engaged the audience, entertained the audience. And as you're pointing out, there's a certain amount of acting talent that needs to be used. And there's many things. There's being animated and using your hands. There's using voice impressions or inflections. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And the fact that you teach joke writing, basically the skills you learn from Artie, how to put together a joke and make something work is so important. But then being able to present it using some acting skills is really strong advice. That's great, Neil. Thanks.
Right. Well, sure. And, you remind me, like you mentioned Yakov Smirnoff. I can picture him doing the joke, which I'm sure you know, where he says there's no warning shots in Russia. They shoot the guy next to you. That's your warning shot. Okay. So,
exactly.
So, it's a great joke, but he animated it, like you said. I can literally picture him doing that joke from, how many years ago, right? It's an old joke. So, yeah, the way that, I picture Steve Martin doing material. I picture great comedians and the way they did the joke, so they all utilized acting to a great degree.
Well, and that is so true. And Neil, I'm just so blessed that you've had taken the valuable time to come onto my podcast and share some of your thoughts on our unique and difficult industry. Can you do some other things? You have your course. I think you've written some books. Is there anything that we can share with the audience where they can find you or maybe find your course?
Well, right now, yeah, they can go to neilberlinercomedy.com and they can fill out a form if they want me to help them with something. And right now, biggest thing for me is a few friends of mine and I co-wrote a book, a joke book, and it hit #1 on Amazon for new joke books in January. And it's called Ha Ha History. So that's my biggest thing right now. That's my big project.
Wow, that is cool. Well, ladies and gentlemen, jump over to Amazon and look for Ha Ha History and get the latest, hottest joke book. I think, Neil, that's a great opportunity for anybody that is interested in comedy but just enjoys comedy. That's great. It's doing pretty well, huh?
Yeah, it is. I don't have the numbers yet, but as I said, it hit #1. I was very surprised. I looked on Amazon to see if it was even up on Amazon at that point. And it said #1 new joke book next to it. So, yeah, it's getting some attention. So that's really good.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'll be sure to pick up my copy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been so blessed to have Dr. Neil Berliner on our show and sharing this great information about his history as a comedy writer and stand-up comic. Neil, thank you so much for your valuable time.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed this special interview. Stay tuned. We'll have another great show on Sunday. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stand-Up Comedy, your host and MC. For information on the show, merchandise, and our sponsors, or to send comments to Scott, visit our website at www.standupyourhostandmc.com. Look for more episodes soon and enjoy the world of stand-up comedy. Visit a comedy showroom near you.